Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and please remember that this story is inspired by true events, but names and identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. My name is Alara Vance. I am 68 years old, and for 32 years, I worked as the chief surgical nurse at St. Jude Memorial Hospital in Ashwood, Ohio. If you have ever spent 3 decades working inside a trauma center operating room, you learn one fundamental, undeniable truth about human nature. A person's true character is never revealed when they are in absolute control of their environment, but rather in the precise, unguarded moment they believe no one is watching them. The mask of polite society slips only when the audience is perceived to be unconscious, incompetent, or irrelevant. That fundamental truth became the defining lesson of my retirement on a dark, rain-swept Tuesday morning in early November, exactly 3 days after I underwent a highly complex double hip replacement surgery. I was lying flat on my back in Recovery Room 4, the exact same post-operative surgical ward I had personally supervised, staffed, and rigorously managed for the final 20 years of my clinical career. The recovery room smelled exactly as it had for 30 years, a sterile, unyielding combination of sharp antibacterial floor wash, freshly laundered hospital Linston, and the faint, earthy scent of autumn rain, blowing hard against the reinforced window glass overlooking the hospital parking structure. Sitting rigidly in the uncomfortable vinyl visitor's chair positioned exactly 2 feet from the right side of my bed was my 35-year-old daughter-in-law, Chloe. She had arrived precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning, ostensibly to offer familial support and fulfill her social obligation as a dutiful relative. However, her eyes had been locked obsessively onto her glowing smartphone screen since the exact second she walked through the heavy wooden door. Chloe was a high-end luxury real estate broker, married to my only son Marcus, for 8 relatively tense years. She was a woman who navigated the world with the ruthless, calculating precision of an apex predator, constantly evaluating every single person she encountered based strictly upon their liquid net worth, their zip code, and the square footage of their primary residence. To Chloe, human beings were not individuals with souls. They were merely potential commissions wrapped in designer clothing, and anyone who did not fit into her pristine, curated aesthetic was immediately dismissed as a liability. "I am going to tidy up this absolutely depressing room, Alara," Chloe announced suddenly, her voice shattering the quiet rhythm of my cardiac monitor. She stood up briskly from the vinyl chair and brushed a piece of invisible lint from her tailored beige designer blazer. "This bedside table is a complete, unmitigated disaster. It looks like a low-income nursing home in here. The nurses on this floor clearly have no concept of spatial organization." I watched in silent, drug-induced exhaustion as she began aggressively rearranging my personal belongings without asking for my consent. She picked up my favorite Sunday crossword puzzle magazine, the one I had been carefully working on to keep my mind sharp during the agonizing physical therapy sessions, and discarded it directly into the gray plastic waste bin, simply because she felt it looked cluttered. She pushed my reading glasses aside with the back of her hand and shoved my plastic water pitcher to the far, precarious edge of the rolling tray. Then, she turned her attention to the garment resting across the back of the visitor's chair. It was an emerald green wool cardigan. It was thick, heavy, incredibly warm, and undeniably worn by decades of relentless use. The elbows had been meticulously darned twice with matching green yarn. The collar was slightly frayed at the edges from years of friction, and the heavy brass buttons carried the dull, scratched patina of 4 decades of constant, daily service. My mother, Clara Jenkins, had knitted that beautiful emerald cardigan for me during the brutal winter of 1983. Clara had spent her entire adult life working the exhausting, deafening graveyard shift at the Ashwood textile mill, operating heavy industrial weaving looms in a sweltering factory just to afford the tuition for my nursing school education. The brass buttons had been carefully salvaged from the heavy winter work coat of my late father, Elias, a master carpenter who died of a sudden massive heart attack when I was only 14 years old. My mother's calloused hands had knit every single stitch of that wool. My father's memory was secured firmly into every single brass button. I had worn that cardigan on every single freezing night shift for 32 years. It held the faint scent of cedar wood from my closet, the aroma of dried lavender, and the quiet, undeniable dignity of honest, working-class labor. Chloe held the emerald cardigan up by the collar, extending her arm fully, as if she were holding a contaminated biohazard disposal bag. She pinched the heavy wool between her manicured fingernails, wrinkling her nose in absolute, unfiltered disgust. I honestly cannot believe you brought this hideous thing to a public hospital, Ilara. Chloe sneered, turning the sweater around to inspect the darned elbows. It smells like a cheap antique store, and the elbows are practically disintegrating. It is literally rags. I am absolutely not letting you leave this ward wearing this embarrassment when Marcus comes to pick you up. It ruins our entire image. I brought you a nice neutral cashmere wrap from my car. Before I could form a coherent sentence through the thick haze of the narcotic pain medication, Chloe dropped my mother's emerald cardigan directly into the gray plastic trash bin, positioned under the glaring fluorescent lights. The heavy wool settled softly over the white plastic liner, landing right on top of my discarded crossword magazine and a crumpled paper tissue. Chloe dusted her hands off as if she had just disposed of toxic waste. "I will be right back," she said brightly, completely oblivious to the catastrophic, unforgivable line she had just crossed. "I am going down to the cafeteria on the first floor to get an iced macchiato. Do not try to get out of bed. The nurses said you are a fall risk." She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, her designer leather heels clicking sharply against the linoleum corridor in a steady, arrogant rhythm. The room fell completely silent, save for the rhythmic electronic beeping of my heart monitor and the steady hiss of the oxygen valve on the wall. I lay perfectly flat on the stiff hospital mattress, staring intensely at the gray plastic bin sitting exactly 3 feet from the edge of my bed. The heavy pain medications was making the porous ceiling tiles swim above my head, and my freshly reconstructed hip joints throbbed with a deep, agonizing, grinding ache that radiated down to my knees. But underneath the narcotic fog, underneath the physical pain and the exhaustion, 32 years of strict surgical nursing discipline snapped into sharp, absolute adrenaline-fueled focus. When you spend your life in trauma units, you learn that panic is a luxury you cannot afford. When someone looks at the most precious historical artifact of your family's legacy and calls it garbage, you do not cry, you do not scream for the attending nurse, you do not argue with the person who disrespected you. You simply assess the situation, calculate your physical limitations, and execute a surgical, definitive response. I reached up with my right hand and pushed the heavy cotton hospital blanket off my chest. I swung my legs slowly over the edge of the mattress, gritting my teeth so hard my jaw ached as a white-hot spike of agony shot directly through my pelvis. I gripped the cold aluminum pole of my IV stand with my left hand, utilizing its sturdy base as a makeshift walker, and forced myself to stand up on the freezing linoleum floor. I took 3 agonizing, shuffling, excruciating steps toward the gray plastic trash bin. Every single movement felt as though glass shards were grinding inside my hip sockets, but I focused entirely on the emerald wool resting at the bottom of the bin. I reached down, ignoring the burning pain in my lower back, and pulled the cardigan out of the garbage. The wool was cool to the touch. I held it tightly against my chest for 3 long seconds, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of my father's brass buttons pressing against the thin cotton of my hospital gown. Then, moving with the practiced, absolute precision of a woman who had folded thousands of sterile surgical drapes before major operations, I folded the sweater into a tight, perfect square. I unzipped my overnight canvas bag, resting on the lower shelf of the rolling bedside table, tucked the cardigan securely deep inside the main compartment, and zipped it completely shut. I shuffled painfully back to the bed, climbed onto the mattress, pulled the heavy blankets all the way up to my chin, and closed my eyes just as the heavy wooden door swung open, and Chloe walked back into the room holding her iced coffee. She glanced briefly at the empty trash bin, smiled in smug satisfaction, and sat back down in the vinyl chair to resume scrolling through her social media feeds. I lay there in absolute silence, breathing steadily, letting her believe she had won the morning. What my arrogant daughter-in-law did not know, what her shallow, commission-obsessed mind could not possibly have comprehended in a million years, was that my mother had not just knit a simple wool sweater to keep her daughter warm during the graveyard shift. In the autumn of 1994, right after my husband Elias finalized the most important financial transaction of our lives, my mother Clara had carefully sewn a secret, waterproof interior pocket deep inside the right breast lining of that emerald cardigan. She had fastened it with a heavy metal snap salvaged from an old winter coat. And tucked securely inside that hidden pocket was a meticulously preserved legal document that possessed the absolute power to obliterate Chloe's entire artificial world. 2 days later, on a crisp Thursday morning, I was officially discharged from St. Jude Memorial Hospital by my attending orthopedic surgeon. My son Marcus drove his leased luxury SUV to the main entrance to pick me up, while Chloe sat in the passenger seat, tapping furiously on her silver laptop computer. Marcus drove with the stiff, rigid, nervous posture of a man who was desperately trying to project total control over a life that was secretly, catastrophically falling apart behind the scenes. He gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white, flinching at every minor bump in the road. Home was a beautiful, completely paid-off Victorian house situated on Elm Street, currently valued at $480,000. My late husband, Elias, who shared my father's name, and his incredible, meticulous talent for carpentry had spent 10 rigorous years restoring the original oak floors, the wraparound mahogany porch, and the intricate crown molding before he passed away from an aggressive respiratory infection 7 years ago. The house was my sanctuary, a living monument to his craftsmanship and our 40-year marriage. When Marcus parked the SUV in the asphalt driveway, he quickly walked around to help me out of the vehicle, carefully guiding me up the brick front steps, while I leaned heavily on my aluminum medical cane. Chloe followed behind us, carrying my overnight canvas bag into the main hallway and setting it casually on the hardwood floor. I stepped into my home, took a deep breath of the familiar air, and immediately felt the distinct, undeniable vibration of violation. I am a retired chief surgical nurse. My entire professional existence was built upon the rigorous, uncompromising organization of sterile environments, medication schedules, and complex patient charts. I organize my physical world by function and absolute unyielding logic. When I walked into my downstairs study to rest in my leather recliner, my eyes instantly detected the microscopic, telling disruptions that whispered a story of quiet trespass. The third drawer of my solid oak filing cabinet, the heavy bottom drawer where I kept all historical property deeds, insurance policies, and federal tax returns, was closed, but it was not completely flush with the wooden frame. The brass handle was sitting exactly 1/8 of an inch out of alignment. My leather-bound financial ledger, which always sat parallel to the edge of the mahogany desk, had been moved exactly 2 inches to the left. The small, hand-carved wooden box holding my spare house keys had been rotated 45 degrees. "I did some deep cleaning while you were in the hospital, Alara," Chloe announced brightly from the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of imported sparkling water and leaning against the granite counter. "Your study was getting a bit dusty and disorganized, so I reorganized a few of your older files to make space. You really shouldn't be keeping so much paper around at your age. Everything should be digitized on a cloud server." "Thank you, Chloe," I replied, my voice perfectly, terrifyingly neutral. It was the exact same clinical, emotionless tone I used when a junior surgical resident lied to my face about checking a critical patient's vital signs. That night, after Marcus and Chloe finally returned to their upscale, heavily mortgaged condominium across town, I sat completely alone in my quiet house. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking the hours. I locked the heavy deadbolt on the front door, turned on the small brass reading lamp in my first-floor bedroom suite, and opened my canvas overnight bag. I pulled out the emerald green cardigan and spread it carefully across my handmade patchwork quilt. The heavy wool smelled faintly of the sharp hospital antiseptic mixed with the timeless, comforting scent of dried lavender from my cedar closet. I ran my fingertips slowly along the inside right breast panel, feeling the familiar texture of the yarn, until I felt the small reinforced seam my mother had stitched 30 years ago. I unfastened the heavy metal snap with a sharp click and reached deep into the hidden pocket. I pulled out a thick, industrial-grade waterproof plastic sleeve. Inside the sleeve were 3 meticulously preserved, incredibly powerful documents. The first document was an original, fully executed, notarized warranty property deed, dated October 14, 1994. It detailed the absolute cash purchase of a historic, brick-facade fourplex residential building located at 812 Hanover Street in the bustling downtown commercial district of Ashwood. The total purchase price in 1994 was $85,000, paid in full, without a mortgage. The exclusive legal grantee listed on the front page of the deed was my mother, Clara Jenkins. The second document was a handwritten letter, from my mother, penned on thick yellow legal paper in the spring of 2002, exactly 3 months before she died of congestive respiratory failure. The blue ink was faded, but her handwriting was tight, precise, and completely legible. Elara, the Hanover Street fourplex belongs entirely to you. Elias provided the renovation capital from his carpentry business, and you provided the down payment from your endless nursing, overtime shifts. We placed the title in my name strictly to protect you from the aggressive hospital malpractice insurance liability audits back in the early 90s. But the building is yours. You spent your entire youth watching me struggle for pennies in a deafening textile mill. This building is your armor. Keep it secret, keep it safe, and never ever let anyone convince you to sell your foundation. Love always, Mom. The third document was a signed, witnessed, and notarized affidavit from my late husband, Elias Vance. The document formally confirmed that all exterior maintenance, property taxes, structural insurance, and operational costs for the Hanover Street property were paid exclusively from our joint marital checking accounts, establishing undeniable, documented equitable ownership under the laws of the state of Ohio. For 22 years since my mother's passing, I had quietly, efficiently managed the Hanover Street fourplex. Due to the massive revitalization of the downtown district, the property was currently assessed at $550,000. The 4 units were rented to long-term, highly reliable professional tenants, a pharmacist, 2 school teachers, and a graphic designer, generating a consistent, uninterrupted $6,000 in monthly rental income. I handled the property management through a private postal box and a completely separate community bank account. Neither my son Marcus nor his arrogant wife Chloe had ever possessed the slightest inkling that this massive commercial asset existed. They looked at my modest lifestyle, my older sedan, and my coupon clipping habits, and assumed I was a fixed-income widow living entirely off a hospital pension. Until Chloe went digging through my private, confidential filing cabinet while I was bleeding on a surgical table. I knew exactly what Chloe had found. In the very back of the third drawer of my oak filing cabinet, tucked inside a plain unmarked manila folder labeled 1994 Tax Archives, I had kept a single, secondary copy of the municipal property tax assessment for 812 Hanover Street. The assessment bore Clara Jenkins' name, but it listed my Elm Street home as the designated mailing address for the tax bills. My daughter-in-law had found the breadcrumb. She had thrown the actual, legal deed into a hospital trash bin inside my mother's cardigan, completely unaware of the devastating irony, but she had found the municipal tax record. I folded the 3 documents back into the waterproof sleeve, slipped them securely into the emerald cardigan's hidden pocket, and fastened the metal snap. I set the cardigan carefully on the chair beside my bed, and turned off the reading lamp. The next morning, at precisely 8 o'clock, my mobile phone rang on the nightstand. It was Marcus. His voice possessed a tight, vibrating, unnatural edge, the exact recognizable frequency of a man attempting to disguise profound, desperate calculation as innocent, loving concern. Marcus cleared his throat nervously, before speaking. "Good morning, Mom," he said quickly, his words rushing together. "How are the hips feeling today? Did you sleep well?" "I am managing the pain according to the prescribed medication schedule, Marcus," I replied calmly, taking a sip of my black coffee and looking out the window at the morning frost. "What exactly can I do for you this early in the morning?" Marcus hesitated, taking a deep breath that whistled through the phone receiver. "Well, Chloe was doing some deep organizational work in your study on Wednesday, and she stumbled across a very strange municipal tax document. It looks like an annual property assessment for a commercial fourplex building on Hanover Street, listed under Grandma Clara's name." "Mom, do you own a multi-family commercial rental property downtown?" I let the silence hang on the line for 4 deliberate, agonizing seconds. In 30 years of surgical nursing, I learned that silence is a highly effective diagnostic tool. It forces the anxious patient to fill the uncomfortable void with their true symptoms, revealing the exact nature of their panic. "I am the sole legal and equitable owner of that fourplex." "Yes," I said evenly, offering absolutely no further explanation or apology. I could hear a sharp, muffled gasp in the background on Marcus's end. Chloe was clearly listening on speakerphone, hovering right over his shoulder. "Mom, you never told us," Marcus exclaimed, his voice rising sharply in manufactured, theatrical shock. "You have been sitting on a major commercial real estate asset for 2 decades without ever consulting the family." Chloe ran the commercial comparables last night using her brokerage software. "That building is worth over $500,000. You ran the commercial comparables on a private property you discovered, hidden in my locked filing cabinet less than 48 hours ago?" I asked, my tone dropping 10 degrees into absolute razor-sharp ice. Marcus stammered heavily, the verbal equivalent of a man violently stumbling backward after walking into a glass wall. She is a licensed real estate broker. Mom, it is her natural instinct to evaluate property. Look, Chloe says the title is technically cloudy because Grandma's name is still on the primary deed. She thinks we need to have a very serious family meeting this weekend to discuss your asset management. You just had major double hip surgery. You shouldn't be dealing with demanding tenants, plumbing repairs, and property taxes at your age. It is too much stress for your heart." I looked across my kitchen at the emerald cardigan resting on the back of my dining chair. My daughter-in-law had called it disgusting rags. She had thrown it into the garbage without a second thought. And now, she was trying to steal the $550,000 armor hidden inside its wool lining to save her own skin. "A family meeting," I repeated softly, tasting the bitter betrayal in the syllables. "Very well, Marcus. We will have a formal family meeting, here at my house this Saturday, at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. Bring Chloe. We have a great deal of business to discuss, and I want everything out in the open." I disconnected the call, picked up my phone, and immediately dialed the direct, unlisted cellular number of Julian Vance, my 38-year-old nephew. Julian was a ruthless, brilliant corporate litigator and the youngest senior partner at Vance, Sterling and Hayes, the most feared corporate law firm in Columbus, Ohio. Julian was Elias's brother's son, and he possessed the exact same razor-sharp intellect, fierce loyalty, and unyielding moral compass as my late husband. "Aunt Alara," Julian answered on the first ring, his voice warm but crisp. "Tell me your surgical recovery is going smoothly, or I will personally drive down to Ashwood and sue the orthopedic surgeon for medical malpractice." "My hips are healing perfectly according to schedule, Julian," I said steadily, bypassing the pleasantries. "But I need you to drive down here on Saturday morning, in your absolute professional capacity. I have a daughter-in-law who believes she can sell my mother's legacies for a quick commission, and a son who has forgotten exactly whose blood runs in his veins." Julian's voice instantly dropped all familial warmth, shifting seamlessly into absolute, predatory legal focus. Send me the exact address of the property, Aunt Alara. I will have my paralegals conduct a full forensic title audit completed by midnight tonight. And I will be sitting at your kitchen table by 9:30 on Saturday morning with a briefcase full of legal ammunition. The sheer velocity of Chloe's greed was breathtaking. Between Thursday morning and Friday afternoon, she initiated a reckless cascade of unauthorized, highly illegal actions that completely crossed the boundary from presumptuous overreach into documented, actionable professional malpractice. I learned the exact timeline of her treachery because Julian did not just conduct a simple title audit. He deployed his law firm's proprietary investigative software and deep industry connections to track the digital footprints surrounding the Hanover Street property. On Friday afternoon, Julian called me with his preliminary forensic findings. Aunt Alara, Julian said, his voice tight with professional disgust and disbelief. Your daughter-in-law is not just looking for a simple commission check. She is desperately trying to plug a massive, catastrophic financial hemorrhage. I pulled the public civil dockets and credit profiles for Marcus and Chloe. They are currently buried under $150,000 of high-interest, unsecured commercial debt resulting from 3 failed luxury condominium flips last year. The market turned against them, and they are exactly 60 days away from complete financial ruin and catastrophic default. That explained the terrifying urgency. The Hanover Street fourplex was not just an asset to Chloe. It was a $550,000 life raft, and she was willing to drown me to climb aboard. It gets significantly worse, Julian continued, the rapid, percussive clicking of his mechanical keyboard echoing loudly in the background. I pulled the multiple listing service backend access data utilizing a contact at the state board. She actively generated a phantom draft listing in the system, and she has already contacted 2 commercial property investment firms in the city, offering the fourplex as an upcoming off-market family distress sale for $490,000 for a rapid cash close. She is actively soliciting commercial buyers and negotiating a price for a property she does not own. I clarified, my pulse remaining absolutely, clinically steady despite the magnitude of the betrayal. Exactly, Julian confirmed, his tone turning deadly. But here is the killing blow. Aunt Alara, Chloe's mother, Brenda the woman, who spent 20 years working as a paralegal before getting fired for documented ethical violations, called St. Jude Memorial Hospital this morning. Brenda explicitly pretended to be your designated medical proxy. She tried to formally request your post-surgical psychiatric evaluation and cognitive competency scores, claiming you were suffering from severe, debilitating post-operative delirium and dementia. My grip tightened around the telephone receiver until my knuckles turned white. They were not just trying to quietly sell my building, they were aggressively laying the legal groundwork to have me declared mentally incompetent so Marcus could seize total medical and financial power of attorney. They wanted to strip away my autonomy, lock me in a sterile nursing facility against my will, and liquidate my financial foundation to pay off their own catastrophic investment failures. Did the hospital records department release the files? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Absolutely not, Julian said with a grim, humorless chuckle. You were the chief surgical nurse at that hospital for 30 years, Aunt Alara. The patient advocacy director recognized Brenda's voice, flagged the inquiry as highly fraudulent, and immediately locked your medical file behind a security firewall. But the digital record of the unauthorized, fraudulent inquiry is permanently preserved in their system logs. What about Marcus? I asked, the deep maternal ache in my chest momentarily cutting through the cold, surgical logic. Is my only son actively participating in this conspiracy? Julian paused, and the silence on the line felt heavier than lead. Marcus is the senior accounting manager for Regional Heritage Logistics, correct? I ran a discreet compliance check through an IT contact in their corporate sector. He blatantly violated his employer's strict acceptable use policy to surveil your net worth from his office desk. My own son, the boy I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the boy I had worked night shifts to put through university, had used his corporate terminal to calculate exactly how much cash he stood to inherit if I were declared legally incompetent. Julian, I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying calm that I usually reserved for calling time of death in the trauma ward. Draft the formal complaints for the Ohio Real Estate Commission. Draft the ironclad cease and desist orders. I want every single violation meticulously documented on heavy bond paper and placed into physical folders. I will see you on Saturday morning. On Friday evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the doorbell rang. I walked slowly to the foyer, leaning heavily on my aluminum cane, and opened the heavy wooden door to find my next-door neighbor, Evelyn Vance. Evelyn was a 70-year-old retired high school principal with eyes like a hawk, a memory like a steel trap, and a zero-tolerance policy for neighborhood nonsense. "Elara," Evelyn said without any polite preamble, stepping directly into the hallway and crossing her arms over her chest. "I need to tell you something highly disturbing, and I need you to know I have already written it down, signed it, and had it legally notarized at the bank this afternoon." "Come into the kitchen, Evelyn," I said gently, guiding her toward the dining table. "Tell me exactly what happened. Your arrogant daughter-in-law Chloe came marching through the neighborhood yesterday afternoon like she owned the street," Evelyn reported, her jaw set in righteous anger. "She knocked on my door, and she knocked on the Miller's door across the street. She said you were experiencing advanced dementia symptoms and that she and Marcus were making immediate arrangements to move you into a secure memory care facility by the end of the month." I closed my eyes, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the lie washing over me like cold water. "And what did you say to her, Evelyn?" "I told her she was a bold-faced liar," Evelyn declared fiercely, her eyes blazing. "I told her I just watched you balance your own complex checkbook on the patio 3 days before your surgery, and that your mind is sharper than a surgical scalpel. But Elara, she is actively pre-selling the narrative to the neighbors. She explicitly told the Millers that this Elm Street house would be hitting the real estate market in a few weeks once you were safely relocated. They were coming for the commercial fourplex, and they were coming for the beloved house Elias built. They intended to strip me down to the absolute bone, discard me in a facility, and live comfortably off the marrow of my life's work. I spent Friday night preparing the Plender battlefield with the meticulous care of a general drawing up battle lines. I cleaned the kitchen until the oak table gleamed under the chandelier light. I brewed a fresh, aromatic pot of dark roast coffee and set out the fine porcelain cups Elias had bought for our 20th anniversary. Then, I retrieved my mother's emerald green cardigan from my bedroom. I folded it with absolute, geometric precision and placed it directly in the center of the oak dining table, smoothing out the wool so the brass buttons caught the light perfectly. Inside the hidden pocket, the waterproof sleeve held the original deed, my mother's letter, and Elias's affidavit. Beside the folded cardigan, I placed a towering stack of manila folders containing 22 years of pristine property tax receipts, maintenance invoices, and tenant lease agreements for the Hanover Street fourplex. When you spend 32 years running a surgical ward, you learn that survival depends entirely on preparation. You do not panic when the cardiac monitors start screaming. You rely on the charts, the historical data, and the irrefutable truth of the instruments in front of you. Saturday morning arrived with a cold, biting gray frost covering the front lawn. At exactly 9:30, Julian Vance walked through my front door. He was wearing a custom-tailored, dark charcoal suit, carrying a heavy combination-locked leather litigation briefcase, and radiating the lethal, hyper-focused professionalism of a shark smelling fresh blood in the water. "Good morning, Aunt Elara," Julian said softly, kissing my cheek. He looked at the emerald cardigan resting in the center of the table, then at the massive stack of receipts. He opened his briefcase with a sharp click and pulled out 3 thick, professionally bound legal dossiers, placing them neatly beside my folders. "The quiet title action has been drafted and is ready for filing on Monday morning," Julian reported efficiently, taking a sip of coffee. The real estate commission complaint is finalized and fully documented. The HR notification for Marcus's employer is sealed in this envelope. We have the complete digital forensic trail for both the bank access and the hospital inquiry. They have absolutely nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no defense. Thank you, Julian, I said, taking my seat at the head of the long oak table. When they arrive, you will remain entirely silent until I introduce you. I want them to lay all their cards on the table, expose their entire strategy, and commit to their lies before we burn the table down. At exactly 10:02 a luxury SUV pulled into my driveway. The family meeting was about to begin. Marcus and Chloe walked through the front door, but they did not arrive alone. Trailing closely behind them was Chloe's mother, Brenda, a woman whose sharp, calculating eyes immediately scanned the crown molding and the antique furniture like a pawnshop appraiser calculating retail value. Brenda had absolutely no legitimate reason to be in my home, but her presence confirmed everything Julian had uncovered. They were operating as a coordinated syndicate, a triad of greed united by desperation. Marcus looked exhausted. His shoulders were slumped, and the dark, bruised circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights buried under $150,000 of secret debt. Chloe, however, was armored in absolute professional confidence. She wore a pristine beige power suit, carried a sleek silver laptop under her arm, and offered me a brilliant, predatory smile. "Good morning, Alara." Chloe chimed cheerfully, marching into the kitchen and setting her laptop directly onto Elias's oak table. She completely ignored Julian, who was sitting quietly in the corner chair, assuming he was simply a visiting neighbor, a physical therapist, or a medical assistant. "It is so incredibly good to see you sitting up and looking well. We have a lot of important family logistics and financial planning to cover today." Brenda sat silently in the corner chair near the pantry, clutching her designer handbag tightly, watching the room with the practiced, predatory gaze of a woman waiting for the trap to spring. I remained seated at the head of the table. My mother's emerald cardigan sat perfectly folded directly in front of me, the brass buttons gleaming under the overhead chandelier. "Take a seat, Marcus," I said, my voice projecting the calm, commanding resonance of a charge nurse directing a trauma bay during a mass casualty event. Marcus sat down heavily, refusing to meet my eyes, staring down at the polished wood grain of the table. Chloe remained standing, opening her laptop with a flourish and spinning the high-resolution screen around so I could clearly see a brightly colored, aggressively detailed financial spreadsheet. "Elara, we love you deeply, and we want to ensure you are fully protected during this difficult aging process." Chloe began, utilizing the patronizing, synthetic, perfectly rehearsed tone of a corporate HR representative delivering a termination notice. "As you know, the cognitive and psychological side effects of major surgery in elderly patients can be severe. We feel it is absolutely critical to consolidate your assets now, so Marcus can assume financial and medical power of attorney. This will remove the immense stress of property management from your declining health." She tapped the glowing screen with her manicured fingernail. "We have cataloged your assets. The Elm Street house is worth approximately $480,000. But more importantly, we discovered the municipal tax record for the Hanover Street fourplex. That commercial property is worth at least $550,000. Chloe leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the table, her eyes glittering with greed. "Because the title is technically clouded under Clara's name, selling it on the open market will be a legal nightmare for you. Fortunately, I have extensive, highly placed contacts in commercial real estate. I can facilitate an immediate, off-market cash sale to an investment group for $490,000. We use those proceeds to pay off any outstanding liabilities, move you into a premier, luxury assisted living facility, and secure your long-term care. It is the only logical, responsible solution." Silence descended upon the kitchen. The coffee percolator hissed softly in the background. I looked directly at Marcus. "Is this what you want, Marcus? You genuinely believe I am cognitively declining?" You believe I should sell my mother's legacy to an off-market investor, surrender my independence, and move into a facility. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his collar. He stared at his hands resting on the table. Mom, it is just too much responsibility for you now. The duplex is a massive liability. Chloe knows the market better than anyone. We are just trying to protect you from being overwhelmed. Protect me, I repeated, the words tasting like bitter copper in my mouth. I slowly reached out and placed my right hand firmly over the folded emerald wool of my mother's cardigan. Chloe, do you recognize this garment? Chloe blinked, momentarily derailed by the abrupt shift in conversation. She looked down at the cardigan, her nose wrinkling in familiar, unfiltered disgust. Of course I do, it is that hideous, ragged sweater you brought to the hospital. I threw it in the trash where it belongs, but I see you fished it out. Honestly, Elara, this exact type of hoarding behavior is precisely why we are so concerned about your mental state and decision-making capabilities. You threw this cardigan into a hospital waste bin while I was under the influence of heavy narcotic painkillers. I stated clearly, ensuring every single syllable resonated in the quiet room. You called it rags. You looked at the object my mother knitted with her calloused hands. The object that kept me warm during 30 years of midnight hospital shifts, and you deemed it garbage to be discarded. I unfastened the metal snap on the interior pocket. The sharp click echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. What you did not know, Chloe, is that a nurse's cardigan is designed for utility, I said, pulling the thick waterproof sleeve from the hidden pocket and sliding the 3 pristine, perfectly preserved legal documents onto the oak table. My mother sewed this pocket in 1994, and she hid a building inside it. Chloe's confident smile faltered, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Brenda leaned forward in her corner chair, her eyes narrowing sharply as she recognized the heavy, unmistakable bond paper of a legal deed. I picked up the first document and held it up to the light. This is the original, fully executed, notarized warranty deed for 8112 Hanover Street. Clara Jenkins, grantee. It has been perfectly preserved for 3 decades. I picked up the second document. This is a handwritten letter from my mother, specifically outlining that the property was purchased with my money and belongs exclusively to me, establishing clear, undeniable, equitable intent. I picked up the third document, and this is a sworn affidavit from Elias Vance, confirming that all maintenance, renovations, and taxes have been paid from our marital accounts. I have managed this property, paid the insurance, and collected the rent continuously for 22 years. I pushed the heavy stack of manila folders across the polished oak table, stopping right in front of Chloe's laptop. These are 22 years of immaculate property management records, tax receipts, and tenant leases. A resulting trust under Ohio state law, verified by decades of continuous, uncontested operation. Chloe stared blankly at the documents, the color draining rapidly from her face until she was as pale as a ghost. The massive off-market commission she had secretly promised her aggressive creditors was vaporizing into thin air right before her eyes. That doesn't change anything, Chloe stammered, her voice rising in pitch as absolute panic began to set in. The deed is still technically in Clara's name. You cannot legally sell it without going through a massive, expensive probate battle. You still need my help to navigate the commercial investors. It was time to introduce the apex predator. Chloe, I said calmly, gesturing to the man sitting silently in the corner chair. Allow me to formally introduce my nephew, Julian Vance, senior partner in corporate litigation at Vance, Sterling and Hayes. Julian stood up slowly, buttoning his custom suit jacket with deliberate precision, his eyes locked onto Chloe with absolute, devastating, predatory focus. Good morning, Chloe, Julian said, his voice smooth and deadly. I have reviewed Elara's documentation extensively. Under Ohio property law, 22 years of continuous management, tax payments, and documented equitable intent create an airtight resulting trust. We are filing a quiet title action on Monday morning at the county courthouse. The property will be fully titled in Alara's name within 40 days. There will be no probate battle, no off-market sale, and certainly no real estate commission for you. Brenda shot up from her chair in the corner, her face red with fury. You cannot do this. This is a private family matter. We have a legal right to manage her medical and financial well-being. Julian turned his gaze to Brenda, freezing her in her tracks with a look of pure contempt. Sit down, Brenda. We have not even reached the criminal portion of this meeting. Julian opened his heavy leather briefcase and withdrew the 3 bound legal dossiers, placing them on the table with 3 heavy, sequential, terrifying thuds. Let us review the digital forensics, Julian announced, opening the first dossier and smoothing the page. Chloe, on Thursday afternoon, you utilized your official real estate broker credentials to access the multiple listing service backend. You ran 6 separate unauthorized searches on the Hanover Street property. You generated a phantom listing, and you contacted 2 commercial investment groups offering a property you do not own and have absolutely no legal authority to market. Julian slid a printed log sheet across the table. Marketing a property without a signed listing agreement or the owner's explicit consent is a direct, actionable violation of the Ohio Real Estate Commission's ethical code. We have drafted a formal complaint, complete with the MLS's IP logs, which will result in the immediate, permanent suspension of your broker's license. Chloe gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hand as she stared at the printed, undeniable evidence of her own hubris. Julian opened the second dossier and turned his piercing gaze to Brenda. Brenda, on Thursday morning, you contacted St. Jude Memorial Hospital, explicitly impersonating a medical proxy, and attempted to unlawfully obtain Alara's confidential psychiatric records to build a fraudulent competency case. The patient advocacy director flagged your call immediately. We have the documented hospital security report. That is a federal HIPAA violation and attempted medical fraud. Brenda sank back into her chair, her face turning a mottled, terrified gray, her hands shaking violently in her lap. Julian opened the third dossier and looked directly at Marcus. And finally, Marcus, on Wednesday morning at exactly 8:52 a.m., you utilized your corporate financial audit terminal at Regional Heritage Logistics to bypass standard security protocols and run an unauthorized surveillance search on your mother's private banking assets. Marcus flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck across the face. Your company's IT compliance software flagged the URL access, Julian stated coldly. You blatantly violated federal banking privacy laws and your employer's strict acceptable use policy. If this dossier is mailed to your HR department on Monday morning, you will be terminated for cause by Tuesday afternoon, forfeiting your pension and rendering you utterly unemployable in the financial sector for the rest of your life. The kitchen fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The trap had not just sprung, it had completely crushed every single avenue of their deception. They had walked into the house, believing they were dealing with a confused, vulnerable widow recovering from surgery who could be easily manipulated. Instead, they had walked directly into an ambush orchestrated by a chief surgical nurse and a corporate litigator who possessed the forensic receipts for every single lie they had ever told. The power dynamic had completely inverted in the span of 4 minutes. The bright, patronizing spreadsheets Chloe had brought to dictate my future were now buried under the crushing weight of Julian's forensic dossiers. I looked down the length of the oak table directly at my son. Marcus was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of raw terror and overwhelming, suffocating shame. The truth of his $150,000 debt was no longer a secret, and the brutal reality of his corporate surveillance was sitting in black and white right in front of him. You checked my bank accounts from your office computer, Marcus, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the absolute weight of maternal heartbreak. You sat at your desk and calculated my net worth to see if I had enough cash to bail you out of your wife's disastrous real estate investments. You didn't ask me for help, you didn't talk to me, you surveilled me like a target, Mom. I was desperate, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the artificial confidence he had projected earlier. He finally looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. "We are drowning." Chloe's condo flips went completely underwater. "The aggressive creditors are calling my office every day." When Chloe found the tax record for the fourplex, she convinced me that if we just managed the sale, we could save the house and set you up somewhere safe. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. Sorry does not forge a medical proxy, Marcus," I replied, completely immune to the emotional manipulation. "Sorry does not go to the neighbors and lie about my sanity." I turned my fierce gaze to Chloe, who was staring at the real estate commission complaint with the paralyzed horror of a woman watching her entire career and social standing evaporate in real time. "You threw my mother's cardigan into a hospital waste bin," I said to Chloe, my tone turning to absolute, biting frost. "You called it disgusting rags. You looked at the physical embodiment of my mother's sacrifice, the wool she knit with her own hands, and you deemed it worthless. And then, you walked through my neighborhood and told my friends I was losing my mind, just so you could sell the house my husband built with his bare hands." I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "I am giving you exactly one exit," I announced, laying out the terms of their surrender with surgical precision. "Chloe, you will sign a formal legally binding cease and desist order today, permanently surrendering any claim, right, or interest in my medical care, my finances, and my properties. You will never, ever contact a real estate investor regarding my assets again. Brenda, you will sign an identical order forbidding you from ever contacting a medical facility on my behalf for the rest of your life." I looked at Julian, who nodded sharply and slid two heavy, perfectly drafted legal documents across the table, complete with signature lines and notary stamps. "If you sign these documents right now," I continued, "the real estate commission complaint remains locked in Julian's briefcase. The hospital fraud report remains sealed, and the HR notification for Marcus's employer is destroyed. You walk out of this house with your careers intact, and you figure out how to pay off your own $150,000 debt without stealing my mother's legacy." Chloe stared at the cease and desist order. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached into her designer purse, pulled out a gold fountain pen, and signed her name on the dotted line. She didn't read the clauses. She simply signed it with the desperate speed of a cornered animal trying to chew off its own leg. Brenda scurried out of her corner chair, snatched the pen from her daughter, and signed her document just as frantically. Julian collected the signed papers, verified the signatures carefully, and placed them securely into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a final echoing click. "The meeting is adjourned," Julian announced coldly. "Get out of her house." Chloe slammed her silver laptop shut, shoved it into her bag, and walked out the front door without looking back. Brenda followed right on her heels, the two of them disappearing down the driveway in a cloud of humiliation and defeated greed. Marcus remained seated at the table. He looked at the empty chairs, then up at me. The reality of what he had almost allowed his wife to do to his own mother was finally crushing the breath out of him. "Mom," Marcus choked out, burying his face in his trembling hands. "How do I ever fix this? How do I ever make this right?" I looked at my son. I thought about the thousands of night shifts I had worked to put him through college, and the hundreds of times Elias had stood at this very table teaching him how to measure wood and be an honest man. "You don't fix it today, Marcus," I said quietly, offering no immediate absolution. "You go home. You face the consequences of your debt like a man, you evaluate the integrity of the woman you married, and you figure out exactly who you want to be for the rest of your life. The door is not locked, but you have to earn the right to walk back through it." Marcus nodded slowly, his face streaked with tears. He stood up, kissed the top of my head gently, and walked out of the house. The heavy front door clicked shut, the kitchen was quiet again. I was alone with Julian, the coffee percolator, and the emerald green cardigan resting on the oak table. 3 months later, the cold frost of winter surrendered to the bright, promising thaw of a Midwestern spring, bringing with it a profound and permanent architectural shift in our lives. Julian executed the quiet title action exactly as promised. The legal transition was flawless. 40 days after our intense kitchen confrontation, the county recorder officially stamped the deed for 8112 Hanover Street. The title transferred cleanly from Clara Jenkins to Alara Vance. The historic fourplex was legally, unassailably mine, protected by an ironclad trust that Julian designed to ensure Chloe could never attempt a probate challenge in the future. The consequences of the family meeting rippled outward with brutal, uncompromising justice over the following weeks. Without my $550,000 property to liquidate, Marcus and Chloe were forced to face the reality of their massive financial overextension. In late January, Chloe's luxury real estate brokerage formally terminated her contract due to performance and whispered rumors of unethical off-market dealings that had circulated through the community. Stripped of her primary income and facing imminent default, they were forced to sell their upscale condominium at a massive loss, completely wiping out their equity just to satisfy their aggressive creditors. They moved into a modest, cramped two-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. The designer blazers and luxury leased vehicles were replaced by strict budget constraints and the harsh, unforgiving arithmetic of living within their actual means. Marcus kept his job as an accounting manager because I kept my word and withheld the IT logs from his HR department, but the shock of the confrontation had fundamentally altered him. He began attending intensive individual therapy twice a week to untangle the years of passive complicity he had surrendered to Chloe's ambition. He visits me every Sunday morning now, sitting at Elias's oak table, drinking black coffee, and doing the slow, painful work of rebuilding our relationship through genuine accountability, rather than manufactured charm. As for me, I embraced my retirement with a renewed fierce independence. I still manage the Hanover Street fourplex myself, every month, the $6,000 in rental income deposits cleanly into my community bank account. But I no longer hoard the safety net purely for survival. In honor of my mother's grueling years at the textile mill, I took a large portion of the commercial rental revenue and established the Clara Jenkins Memorial Nursing Scholarship at the local community college, providing full tuition assistance to 2 first-generation nursing students every single year. And every Wednesday afternoon I drive my reliable sedan to St. Jude Memorial Hospital, walking through the same sliding glass doors where my daughter-in-law once tried to erase me. I volunteer in the pediatric oncology ward, sitting in the sunlit recreation room, surrounded by children who need quiet comfort. I bring a heavy canvas tote bag with me. Inside the bag are skeins of thick, high-quality wool and a set of wooden knitting needles. I sit by the window and knit cardigans. I knit them in bright, cheerful colors: emerald green, ocean blue, and sunflower yellow. I use heavy brass buttons and I stitch them with the exact same meticulous precision my mother taught me 40 years ago. And inside the right breast panel of every single cardigan I knit, I sew a small, hidden interior pocket, fastened with a sturdy metal snap. When I hand the warm sweaters to the young patients, they always discover the hidden compartment. They use it to store their favorite trading cards, small plastic toys, or secret notes from their parents. It gives them a safe place to hold the things that matter most to them when the rest of their world feels terrifying and completely out of control. Last week, Rachel, a brilliant young floor nurse whom I had personally trained 5 years ago, stopped by my chair in the recreation room. She watched my wooden needles clicking steadily against the green wool and smiled warmly. "You never really retired, did you, Alara?" Rachel asked, adjusting her stethoscope. "You are still taking care of everyone on this ward." "Old nurses never retire, Rachel," I replied softly, tying off a perfect knot on the cuff. "We just change our instruments." I looked down at the cardigan resting in my lap. I was wearing my mother's emerald green wool. The cuffs were neatly darned, the brass buttons gleamed, and the hidden pocket rested securely against my chest, empty now, because the armor it once carried had done its job perfectly. My daughter-in-law looked at this sweater and saw nothing but rags. She saw an old woman recovering from surgery and assumed I was a vulnerable target, a stepping stone to fund her artificial lifestyle. She threw my history into the trash, completely unaware that the very thing she discarded held the absolute power to destroy her. But that is the ultimate lesson of the hospital ward, the carpenter's table, and the textile mill. The strongest things in this world are rarely the most polished, the most modern, or the most expensive. The strongest things are built by calloused hands, forged in the quiet hours of the night shift, and held together by the invisible threads of absolute, unyielding love. My mother hid a building inside a sweater to ensure I would never fall. I wore that sweater to ensure her sacrifice would never be forgotten. And when the time came, I used her hidden armor to protect the house my husband built and the life I earned. You can reorganize my filing cabinets, you can run unauthorized comparables on my assets, but if you ever mistake my silence for weakness or my mother's cardigan for garbage, you will quickly discover that a surgical nurse knows exactly where to make the deepest cut. The legacy of the emerald cardigan did not just stop with the protection of my assets. It extended into the very fabric of my community. The Clara Jenkins Memorial Nursing Scholarship recently graduated its first 2 nurses, both young women who had worked full-time jobs just to afford their textbooks, exactly as I had done all those years ago. They attended their pinning ceremony, wearing the emerald green cardigans I had knitted for them, each with a hidden pocket containing a small, handwritten note, encouraging them to always protect their foundation. Marcus and Chloe's marriage remains strained, held together by the fragile threads of shared debt rather than shared respect. Chloe's mother, Brenda, has completely stopped inserting herself into their lives, terrified that Julian might still possess the hospital fraud records. They live quietly, paying their bills, acutely aware that the massive financial safety net they tried to steal is now entirely out of their reach, securely locked away in a trust that serves the greater good. My days are filled with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and rigorously defended. I tend to the tomato plants in the backyard that Elias loved so much. I drink coffee on the wraparound porch, watching the neighborhood children ride their bicycles down Elm Street. I review the maintenance logs for the Hanover Street fourplex, ensuring the plumbing and the roof remain in immaculate condition for my tenants. And every single evening, when the autumn wind blows cold across the Ohio plains, I wrap the heavy wool of my mother's cardigan around my shoulders. The brass buttons feel like a shield against the chill, and the empty interior pocket rests comfortably over my heart. I survived the grueling night shifts. I survived the agonizing physical therapy of double hip replacement. And I survived the devastating betrayal of the people who were supposed to protect me. I survived because I was equipped with the armor of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. When you spend your life reading vital signs, you learn that a steady pulse is the ultimate indicator of survival. My pulse is steady, my foundation is secure, and my mother's legacy remains absolutely, undeniably untouched. That is my story: a discarded sweater in a hospital trash bin, a secret waterproof pocket, and a profound lesson in the devastating mathematics of consequence. Never underestimate the quiet ones, never assume that age equates to vulnerability, and never, ever throw away a nurse's cardigan without checking the pockets first.